The late summer sun hung low over the town of Dry Creek, bleeding fire into the sky. Dust swirled with each step of horses and boots, settling thick in the throats of men who had long since given up on spitting it out. The wooden facades of the saloon, the general store, and the sheriff's office leaned tiredly against one another, as if the years had pushed them down toward the dirt. At the edge of the main street, men had gathered in a tight circle. Their boots shifted, spurs clinked, and voices growled low with anticipation. An auction was underway, but not for cattle, not for land. This was Dry Creek, and here, desperation sold for coin. On the rough, hewn platform stood a woman with a sack pulled over her head. Her hands were bound loosely in front, not tight enough to bruise, but enough to remind her she was property until otherwise decided. Her dress was plain, dusty, the hem torn as though she'd walked a long way. "All right, gents," barked the auctioneer, a squat man with a whiskey-stained vest and a voice that rattled like dice in a tin cup. "We got ourselves a fine lady here. Don't ask questions, don't expect answers. She cooks, she cleans, she ain't afraid of hard work." "Who'll start me off?" a crowd muttered. A few men laughed. Someone spat. From the edge of the circle, Elias Boone shifted his weight. A broad-shouldered lumberjack, Elias stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, a man carved from pine logs and hard winters. His beard was thick, his hands scarred, his shirt stiff with resin and sweat. He was known in Dry Creek, but only in whispers. The quiet giant who worked the timberline alone, felling trees where no one else dared. He seldom came into town, and when he did, he spoke little. But today something had pulled him here. $2, someone called, half laughing. The auctioneer slapped the railing. "2 to start. Who'll make it 3? Elias's jaw tightened. The crowd's laughter cut through him. He wasn't sure if it was the cruelty of the auction or the way the sack covered the woman's face that stung worse. She wasn't cattle. She wasn't a mule. The bidding rose sluggishly. $3, then 4. But when the price touched 5, the voices fell away. No one cared to pay that much for a mystery. The woman shifted slightly on the platform, and though the sack hid her face, Elias thought he saw her shoulders tremble, not with fear, but with some quiet strength, like a tree bending in a storm yet refusing to snap. 5 once, 5 twice, 6. Elias's voice thundered before he knew he'd spoken. The crowd turned, murmuring. The lumberjack, spending coin on a woman. The auctioneer's grin widened. "We got 6! Any higher." Silence. "Sold." The gavel cracked down. To the lumberjack for $6. But Elias shook his head slowly. "No, 2. The auctioneer blinked. "What?" $2. Elias repeated, stepping forward. His voice carried the weight of felled timber. "That's what I pay. Not a cent more." The crowd bristled. Someone laughed nervously. Another man muttered, "He'll fight the whole town for it. You best believe him." The auctioneer hesitated, sweat slicking his temples. Finally, with a shrug, he slammed the gavel again. "Sold for 2. Elias mounted the steps, towering over the auctioneer, and cut the rope binding the woman's wrists. Gently, he reached up and pulled the sack away. The crowd leaned in. Underneath was a young woman, her hair dark as raven feathers, tangled from travel. Her face was pale, cheeks hollow, but her eyes burned with a steady, defiant fire. She blinked against the sunlight, then lifted her chin. "Name," Elias said simply, his voice low, meant only for her. The woman's lips parted. She hesitated, then whispered, "Clara." Something in that name struck Elias harder than any axe blow. It wasn't just a name, it was a beginning. Elias straightened, facing the crowd. His voice was steady, unshakable. "She's my wife now." The street went silent. Then laughter, jeers, disbelief. But none dared step forward. Clara stood at his side, her wrists still red from the rope. For the first time in a long time, Elias Boone felt the ground shift beneath him, not from timber falling, but from fate itself. The town of Dry Creek shrank behind them as Elias Boone guided his wagon north. The single mule pulling it wasn't much to look at. Thin, hipped and stubborn, but it had strength enough for the rocky trail. Clara sat beside him on the wooden seat, silent, her hands folded in her lap. The sack she'd worn at the auction was gone, left trampled in the dust of the street. Elias hadn't asked how she came to be there, and she hadn't offered. The road stretched wide with silence. broken only by the squeal of wagon wheels and the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. The air grew sharper as the land rose toward the timberline. Pines thickened along the ridges, their resin filling the air with a sharp, biting scent. Sunlight lanced through the branches, striping Clara's face in gold. She looked around as though the world itself was swallowing her whole, yet there was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet study. Elias cleared his throat. The sound startled him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd spoken without need. "You eat?" he asked. Clara blinked at him. "Not since yesterday." He nodded once, flicking the reins. Words were tools to Elias, not comforts. He had no gift for chatter, no smooth drawl like the gamblers at the saloon. But something about the way her voice carried, soft, but threaded with steel, made him want to speak again. By dusk, the trail bent toward the valley where Elias had built his cabin. Smoke curled faint from the chimney, a promise of warmth. The structure was plain but sturdy, logs stacked tight, roof pitched against heavy snow, and an axe sunk deep in the chopping block outside. He stopped the wagon, set the brake, and climbed down. Clara followed, smoothing the folds of her dress, though it did little to hide the dust and travel stains. She looked up at the cabin, then at him. "You live here alone?" Elias nodded. "5 winters." Clara's gaze lingered on the door, the shuttered windows, the wild stretch of pine behind. A life carved out of wilderness. It was either freedom or prison, depending on who was looking. Inside, Elias lit the lamp. Shadows jumped against the log walls. The cabin smelled of pine pitch, smoke, and the faint tang of iron from the tools that lined the walls. He set a pot of beans over the fire, the motion practiced, thoughtless. Clara stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped before her. She seemed out of place, like a porcelain figure set among rough, hewn timber. "You can sit," Elias said, motioning to the table. She did, folding herself onto the chair. For a while, the only sound was the crackle of fire. Then Clara spoke. "You didn't have to do it." Elias looked over his shoulder. "Do what?" "Buy me." Her words were steady, but beneath them he heard the tight coil of pride. "You could have walked away." Elias stirred the beans, jaw working. "Finally," he said. "Couldn't leave you there?" "Why?" The question hung in the air, sharper than the axe by the door. Elias didn't answer right away. He ladled beans into 2 tin bowls and set one before her. She took it, studying his face as if trying to read the truth he wouldn't say aloud. When she finally ate, Elias sat opposite her. They ate in silence, the firelight dancing over their faces. But even as the quiet settled, the wilderness outside carried its own voice. The low howl of wolves somewhere up the ridge, the creak of pine trunks swaying in the night. And farther still, beyond the reach of cabin light, a different danger moved. Down in Dry Creek, word had already begun to spread. The lumberjack had paid $2 for a sack, headed woman, and claimed her as his wife. Men laughed at the story, but not all laughter was harmless. There were those who remembered Clara, those who might come looking. And the West had a way of ensuring the past never stayed buried for long.